In Madrid, Spain's capital city, a mysterious man recruits 8 people to carry out a heist that he meticulously formulated for years. The basic premise of his heist is to begin an assault on the Royal Mint of Spain, print out 2.4 billion euros, and escape with the cash through a self-built tunnel, pursuing the unjustly accumulated wealth from the banks to redistribute it to the real economy. Basically, he wanted to take from the rich and give to the poor. Over 100 million euros was scattered freely all over Madrid for everyone to take. This man, known as Profesor, along with his associates, infiltrated La Casa de Papel and successfully pulled off the well-known money heist. Hypothetically, if the money heist is guaranteed to be successful and El Profesor invites you to join his gang, would you be willing to? More importantly, is El Profesor's money heist morally right, or is it wrong? Some people, like the teleologists, would consider this act as morally right, because the consequences result in the good for the greatest number, or the good of the people. However, the ontologists, particularly the famous Immanuel Kant, would consider this morally wrong, and today we will be talking all about this. So, the first half of this video will talk about the deontological theories, specifically the distinction between the divisions of deontology, the Kantian ethical system, the universalizability test, and the categorical imperative. So, let's begin. Deontology is derived from the Greek word deon, meaning duty. Deontologists believe that an act is morally right on the basis of the nature of the act alone. The consequences of the act are unimportant in determining what is right. The meaning of the nature of the act varies among deontologists. And to better understand this, let's take for an example cheating on a test. If you were a pure deontologist, then you would judge the nature of the act, or in this case, the nature of cheating, based on its conformity to an immutable moral rule. The consequences are unimportant. If the act is an instantiation of the moral rule, it is right. However, in this case, cheating contradicts a moral rule, therefore it is wrong. As a pure deontologist, for you, there are no defeasible conditions that would make cheating right, even if it was Naruto cheating in the Chunin exams. On the other hand, if you were a mixed deontologist, initially you would admit that the act of cheating in itself is wrong. However, you believe that it may have a defeasible condition depending on the result of the act. So, if Naruto cheats in the Chunin exams to prove himself as a ninja and later on become the hero of the village, as a mixed deontologist, you would only congratulate him, because in that specific instance, the favorable result of cheating makes it right. So, to summarize, the basic contrast between pure and mixed deontologists rests on the significance of the consequences of our moral choices. So, for the pure kind, the consequences are not significant, while the mixed kind considers any favorable consequences. Deontologists also disagree on the moral significance of rules. For rule deontologists, they accept certain moral rules as a foundation of morality. Specific acts are judged in terms of their consistency and inconsistency with these moral rules. Act deontologists, on the other hand, consider both the nature of the act and the rules. So the deliberation of rightness of an act begins with its nature, and the rules only provide guidelines in the application of specific acts in similar moral circumstances. Immanuel Kant employs a combination of pure and rule deontology. His system, called the Kantian morality, is the paradigm of pure rule deontology. According to Kant, no act can be considered good without qualification except for goodwill. And by goodwill, he meant acting with the right intentions in accordance with the correct maxims, doing one's duty for duty's sake, not for the anticipated consequences for oneself or for the greater number. This is the meaning of Kantian morality, duty and duty for the sake of duty. So to better understand this, we must clarify the distinction between acting for the sake of duty and acting in conformity with the duty. For instance, a mother takes good care of her children because she is afraid of her husband's wrath and anger. Even though her actions agree with her moral obligation as a mother, her reason for obeying the obligation of motherhood is wrong. Therefore, she is only acting in conformity with the duty. If she were to recognize that her actions are in accord with the moral obligation which she wholeheartedly accepts, that is the only time where she is acting for the sake of duty. Now, according to Kant, all moral agents are rational. Let's dissect this a bit. Moral agents are beings who can discern right from wrong and be held accountable for their actions. Rational meaning these moral agents each have a rational capacity, which Kant calls autonomy. Kant states that in order to justify morality, you must demonstrate that it is rational, and to justify any moral rule is to demonstrate that it is in accord with the principles of reason. Kant characterizes morality as a system of categorical imperatives. What does this term mean? So first, let's focus on the word imperatives. All imperatives are expressed by the word ought. I ought to do the dishes, I ought to study harder, I ought to start taking better care of myself. Now, all imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. Hypothetical imperatives are dependent on our desires. They are commands that you should follow if you want something. So if you want to get better grades, then you ought to study harder. But if you don't, then you can choose not to follow the imperative. Categorical imperative, on the other hand, are unconditional and unqualified commands. Unconditional meaning it applies to everyone without exemption, and unqualified meaning there is no possibility of the feasible conditions for whatever kind of consequences. So essentially, they are commands that you must follow regardless of your desires. Between the two, how do you figure out what is moral? Kant insists that we must turn to categorical imperatives, and in order to better understand this concept, Kant formulated three main principles. For the first principle, or formula of universal law, which states, act only on the maxim whereby thou canst at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And the subordinate version of this formula, which is Formula 1a, states that although the moral law is not as universal and absolute as the law of nature, we should make our moral decisions as if it was. To apply the first principle, we must utilize what Kant calls the universalizability test. Going back to the topic of money heist, in the case of Kant, in order to determine if it is morally right, he will apply the universalizability test. Can I will that my maxim becomes a universal law? For the first step, state the maxim of your action. Although the money heist seems elaborate and complicated, it all boils down to an act of stealing. So the maxim would be, it is all right to steal if you give a portion of it back to the poor. So for the next step, universalize it into a moral law for everyone to follow. It is all right for everybody to steal from anybody as long as they give a portion of it back to the poor. And for the last step, ask yourself if the law is universalizable. Our new law has a lot of inconsistencies which result to chaos and disorder. So imagine everyone forming their own gang to carry out their own heist. First, if everyone steals from everyone, then everyone will protect their wealth. Therefore, nobody can steal anything anymore. And also, if they give it to the poor, but the poor can also steal money, then they will not be poor anymore. So there would be no poor to give to. So, as you can see, it's very complicated. So in conclusion, the maxim of stealing is not universalizable because it is self-contradictory to do so and it cannot be implemented. As you can see from the first principle, Kant is not concerned with the consequences of the action. His concern is with the logical consistency or the contradiction of will, that an action is immoral whose intent cancels and destroys itself when it is made a universal rule. This is the reason why stealing is morally wrong. It contradicts itself because the result would be that nobody can steal anymore. So what would be the point of this law? So in short, you should not make exceptions for yourself to justify that stealing is right, and you will realize this after imagining that everyone else is doing it. An act is moral if the intent of the action is in harmony with itself when it is made into a universal rule. Moving on to the next principle, Formula 2, or the formula of the end in itself. So act to use humanity both in your own person and the person of every other, always at the same time as an end, never simply as means. This principle emphasizes how we should treat others. We are all what Kant called ends in ourselves, meaning we exist for ourselves and not for others to use like objects. Kant pointed out that we do use each other all the time, but it is not morally wrong as long as we recognize the humanity in them and they agree to be used. What Kant is against is treating people simply as mere means or forcing and deceiving them for your own benefit. So, for the next formula, or the formula of autonomy, so act that your will can regard itself at the same time as making universal law through its maxim. Formula 3 asserts that the moral law is not imposed on the outside, but it emanates from your own will. Your will as a moral agent makes the moral law. And if we don't obey the moral law, we contradict our own nature. And lastly, the Formula 3A advocates for the kingdom of ends, which is an ideal society where everyone recognizes each other as an end in themselves, and therefore have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So, in conclusion, for Kant, reason always involves the test of self consistency, like our example earlier. For him, reason always avoids contradiction. Therefore, reason should be at the center of morality, and the single ultimate rule, which is the categorical imperative, should be the sole criterion of morality. That is all for Module 4, Deontological Theories. What if teleologists and deontologists were combined? The result would be humanist ethics as developed by Acuña. Human ethics considers the consequences of the act and at the same time accepts that there are prima facie duties that moral agents should unconditionally follow. So that is what we will be discussing for the second half of the video, specifically the humanist imperative, the specifications of humanist ethics, theory of man, the teleological and deontological aspects of humanism, the humanist theory on society, principles of justice, and finally, the humanist creed. So, in 5th century BC, an important humanist tenet was attributed to Protagoras: man is the measure of all things. In the same period, Socrates was also preaching the virtue of self-knowledge. He spoke of the wisdom of knowing one's duty to oneself, justice as knowing one's duty to others, and piety as knowing one's duty to God. Humanism came from the Latin term humanitas, meaning cultivated intelligence. The basic premise of humanism is that man is a rational being endowed with the potential for truth, beauty, and moral goodness, and we have the capacity to develop these potentials. Our intellectual facilities define our supremacy as rational beings. During the Italian Renaissance, humanism was also used as an endeavor to break free from the Middle Ages superstition and authoritarianism, because humanism asserts the belief that man's destiny lies in his own hands. In contemporary period, humanism is also significant. There is a growing recognition that humanist philosophy is vital to the very survival of man as a species. Therefore, the humanist imperative, man must develop all of his potentials to the fullest, is unconditional. In Acuña's attempt to construct humanist ethics, he built it upon certain fundamental beliefs about man, society, and government. First, it takes off from a scientific view of man. Secondly, it is a coherent and comprehensive system of beliefs and values which may change the behavioral predisposition of the whole nation if internalized by Filipinos. Last, his humanist ethics shall represent and establish certain concepts, namely, intrinsic good and right, which can be used to evaluate human conduct and be the basis for moral judgment, opportunities in life, which can be used as a yardstick for determining the level of societal development, and principle of justice, which can be used as an analytic tool for the laws, policies, and programs of the government. We will have an in-depth discussion for these terms later on.
Let's move on to the theory of man. Acuña's ethics presents a scientific view of the nature as dynamic and evolving. Man is in the process of changing into something better, not only physically, but in his consciousness as well. Man undergoes qualitative transformation, which we will be exploring more in depth later. The basic premise of humanist ethics is the uncontroversial view that man has certain innate potentials, which can be summed up under four main headings: cognitive, affective, aesthetic, and moral or spiritual. Undeniably, Man feels the need to develop intrinsic worth and equality. Man's equal human worth justifies his equal human rights and human dignity. The intrinsic good and moral obligation. The main value premise of humanist ethics is the development of human potentials is the stuff of morality. Acuña defines the intrinsic good as the actual development of human potentials along cognitive, affective, aesthetic, moral, and spiritual dimensions. So when we develop our human potentials, we experience moral goodness. Therefore, morally significant actions can either be ones that promote or hinder the development of human potential. Moral obligation is defined in terms of the good. The actions that promote development of human potentials are right, while those that retard or hinder the development are wrong. To conclude, the moral principle of humanism states that an action is right if and only if, of all possible courses of actions, it is the one most likely to promote the development of human potential. An action is wrong if it does the reverse. This describes the theological aspects of humanist ethics. Now let's move on to the ontological aspects of humanism, starting with your primary duty. According to Acuña, your primary duty as a human is to develop your potential to the fullest. How did he conclude this? First off, the moment we are born, human potentials exist in all of us, which means that we have the natural inclination to develop these potentials. Over time, with the proper environmental conditions, these potentials develop naturally within all of us. Given free choices, a person will never willingly choose to hinder or stop these potentials either in himself and his humans. And that is our primary duty. And as humans, we have a moral obligation to harness all of our potentials in order to attain the highest level of cognitive, emotive, aesthetic, moral, and spiritual development. This obligation is unconditional and non negotiable, similar to Kant's categorical imperative. Our duty to your fellow men states that you must treat the development of the human potentials of your fellow men as your own. Let me explain. No man is an island. We cannot develop our human potentials in isolation. We need other humans and we need to thrive in a society. So if you demand the right to develop your human potential, then you must also recognize that the same rights exist in your fellow men too. So in short, human equality do not attempt to develop your potentials at the expense of arresting the development of your fellow human beings. Moreover, everyone is morally obligated to help each other in the development of human potentials. The duty to your fellow men is reciprocal. This concludes the deontological aspects of humanist ethics. Now we move on to a humanist perspective on society. A society comprises people or man. Man is born self-centered and selfish. The course of his maturation involves a shift from concept of good as egoistic to the transition of reciprocity and finally to something social and shared which is called social-centric orientation. When a human acquires social-centric orientation, he is qualitatively transformed into a social being. He or she is now responsible for aiding the development of the human potentials of the members of society. Now, a society provides what is called opportunities in life for its members. These opportunities can either be the satisfaction of basic needs or for the development of human potentials. Of course, our basic needs are important because we need to satisfy our physiological needs like shelter, food, sex, clothing, and safety before we can begin to develop our human potentials. Beyond physiological needs, man has higher needs which include the need of belonging and affiliation, self-esteem needs, and others' esteem needs. Opportunities in life are blueprints of human development because they determine how far the members can develop and what they can achieve. For example, education. Every person, no matter the color or economic status, has a cognitive potential waiting to be developed. However, opportunities in life differ for everyone. The quality and accessibility of education is not the same in the Philippines compared to America. Therefore, members of our society may not be able to attain their highest level of development. Acuña believes that man's fundamental right to claim that there is an opportunity in life available to one member. It must, in principle, be available to the other members as well. Obviously, This is not the case for our world. Inequality is prevalent in our societal structure today. In this essence, the societal structure defines the limits of man's capacity for human development. In conclusion, society is highly important for our morality. Without society, there wouldn't be a concept of morality, and no man can be truly moral. An ideal society for Acuña is one where all the members are provided all the opportunities in life in equal measure. He believes that society exists due to our unconditional obligation to ensure that opportunities in life are available for all members. It follows that the members have a duty to help society fulfill this unconditional obligation. Everyone must be willing to provide support or to sacrifice his personal interest to ensure the provision of equal opportunities in life for all the members. After all, the development of the whole society is more important than the development of any of its members. Theory of government. Society itself has no power to enforce the will of its members. We need to employ an instrument for this important task. That is the government. Acuña believes that all government authority and power comes from the people. From the humanist perspective, the primary function of the government is the promotion of human development through the provisions of more opportunities and benefits for those members, where without governmental intervention, they will not be able to develop their human potentials at all. Consequently, the humanist principle of justice states that a law, policy, program is just, if and only if all possible options, it is the one more likely to differentially distribute opportunities and benefits to those members whose needs are greater. Government must be faithful to this principle of justice. If they break this obligation, the citizens have a right to replace it. Now, if you were to equate this humanist theory with our current societal situation in the country, Acuña believes that there is a meaning to Philippine history. It must be found in specific trends in which new, more, and diverse living options are made available to a growing number of Filipinos, as the structure of society changes and evolves from one historical epoch to the next. The meaning of the Philippine experience is shaped by history. If you look at the Philippine society today, we can see the prevalence of radical inequality in the distribution of opportunities in life, both for the basic needs and for the development of human potential. The inequality is perpetuated by unjust societal structures along economic and social cultural dimensions. The only way to ensure that all the members are given equal opportunities is through structural change and by differentially distributing these opportunities in life.
Lastly, Acuña formulated his humanist creed, which is a systematic summary or just an overview of the important tenets of his humanist ethics. So we will just be flashing these through the screen. If you want to read them one by one, you can either pause the video or check out our handouts. That is all for Module 5, Humanist Ethics. Thank you for listening.